Welcome to Nail Your Job Interview. I am going to start by giving you guys a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be doing. And what I hate about Zoom is my Google stuff gets behind it. Perfect. Okay. So first I want to tell you a little bit about myself because I know there are probably 40 people on here or more that don't already know me. I am a job search strategist. So most people are familiar with the term career coach, which is to me, very broad, and I was very uncomfortable with it. So I call myself a job search strategist. And actually, do I have my agenda earlier? I feel like I skipped past where I actually want to be. Okay, I flipped those slides. I want to talk about what we're going to cover, and then I want to actually go into why I got into this. So I'm going to talk about myself a tiny bit so that you get to know me a little bit. And then we're going to talk about how I kind of set the bar and say, here's how you can determine if you're successful in an interview. And a lot of that is you kind of setting the bar for yourself. Then we're going to talk about the 4 shifts. I think that's why most of you are here. Specifically, what are some other ways to think about how to interview differently? And some might not be completely different for you, but I hope to give you at least 1 or 2 things you can walk away with that you can immediately put into action. And then we're going to do Q&A at the end. You can type in your question at any time. When I get to Q&A, I am going to ask you if you will tell us your question out loud. I really think that makes it a lot more interesting for everybody else. If you really don't want to, or you don't have access to audio, if we don't hear from you, I will read your question. So feel free to put them in, but I am going to ask you to reserve speaking until that moment so that we can get through everything. And because often I'll take like snippets of this and use it for marketing, and I don't want you to be in something you don't want to be in. So if you do it for Q&A, that makes sure that this stays here in what happens today, and it won't be available to other people. So, okay, cool. Let's get started. And like I was saying, so I'm a job search strategist, and I think a lot about why I got into this. If you follow me on Instagram, I talk a lot about the emotions of the job search. And I think it really comes down to this. I was a high school teacher for 8 years. So when I was making a pivot into tech, ended up contracting for Microsoft and then becoming a learning and development program manager for a company called Smartsheet. When I was wanting to make that pivot, I had no freaking clue what I was doing. And it was very clear to me that the world wasn't set up for pivoters. But yet when I got into my roles in tech, I was so welcomed with open arms. And it was as if people were saying to me, we've been looking for you this whole time. I was like, well, then why did LinkedIn basically tell me that I'm not qualified for anything? Like, what is wrong with this system here? And I think more importantly, when I think about interviewing, I actually got to a point in my life, and I never, ever thought I would do this, where I quit a job without fully having the next one lined up. And I can tell you exactly why it happened. I went to an event, a recruiting event for a company I was interested in. And it's not exactly an interview, but you're kind of being interviewed, right? Like when you go to these events, they're vetting you, right? And I remember at the very, very end, I ended up having a conversation with a woman who was really high up in HR. Like I think she was like head of all the recruiters. And she asked me a very simple question about myself. I can't exactly tell you what it was, but I felt myself freeze up because I was so unhappy at work. I was at a point where I felt like I was going to burst into tears at any moment for like 2 weeks. Even though on paper, I had met all my goals. I had pivoted into tech. I'd become a people manager. I had built a team of 8. I had reached all of my goals. I never thought in a million years being a high school teacher, I'd make 6 figures and all these things. And I was miserable. And as I went to think about my job search, it's like, it's so hard to look for a job when you're feeling your worst. And for typically the people that I work with are people that are trying to make big career changes, coming back from a break, haven't interviewed in a long time. Maybe they've had the same job for a really long time. All kinds of things like that and sometimes it's just, I don't feel authentic. I don't know how to sell myself and still be true to myself. And so that is something that I'm really passionate about. It's kind of like I'm going back in time and trying to like help myself, if you will. But I say that to you because I think I'm really freaking skeptical of anyone who comes to you like, I know all the answers. And because I have that teaching background, I might speak authoritatively and passionately about these things. It's like, I feel that the emotional challenges that we all face, that people face in their job search, are really just challenges that are human challenges that we're relating to every day. So I mean, for me, this goes deeper than just anything. It's very personal to me what I do. And I think you'll get that sense as we go through the nitty gritty of actually like interviewing itself. So we talked about what we're going to cover. Here is what I want to talk about in terms of the goal, because what's really important to what I do is I help people get on the career trajectory that they want. And it's all about what you want. It's not what I want for you. And I think sometimes when it comes to career advice, if you're getting advice from your significant other, depending on your age, like your parents, your friend, it's always like, well, you should do this, or you should go after this type of job, or you're not qualified for that. And I feel like everyone else seems to think they know what it is you should be pursuing. And that's not where I'm going to come from with this. The other thing is, when it comes to interviewing, people will come to me, and this is really, really common. And I know why we feel like this. It's, what is it that the interviewer wants to hear? That kind of thinking is, I'm like, okay, they want to know you, right? And I want you to get into a job where they're actually going to appreciate you. While there's a certain amount of privilege that comes with that, I don't want you trying to fit into their box and then realizing that you couldn't say something that was authentic and them feeling like it's not a good fit after you get in. More importantly, I also think when we're trying to fit in someone else's idea of what they want us to be, I think it comes off. And that was something I noticed when I started as a hiring manager doing a lot of interviews for a team that we were building, that sometimes I couldn't put my finger on it. And when my boss and I would talk about it, if we both interviewed the same person, it was often, we felt like the person was feeding us what they wanted to hear. And we felt like they put a wall up and we couldn't get to know them. So a chance for you to do this. So I think the goal is to be able to go into an interview and say, I want to be able to tell my story. I want to tell you what I bring to the table. And yes, either it fits with this job or it doesn't fit with this job. You can pitch yourself for a specific job, but there's certain elements of you that are always going to stay the same in terms of what you've done and what your experience is. And here's what I tell all of my clients. After we work together in interviewing, and usually we work together for like 4 to 6 hours, things like that, you will walk out of an interview and you will know I nailed that. And that's why I called it this, right? Not when someone else tells you, because there are many times that you did a great job in the interview and you didn't get the job for things that were outside of your control. These days, things get pulled. They technically already had a candidate, but they were interviewing just in case that person, doesn't take the job. There's so many times where you don't get the job because there's nothing you could have done. But walking out of an interview and saying, I did a really good job getting myself across. And if they don't pick me, it's because we're not a good match for each other. Kind of just like dating, right? You can go on a date and be like, I was super interesting and fun, but if they don't call me back, it's because I can tell that we might not be a good match, right? That's the idea of success. You feeling like you nailed the interview, not whether you get the job or not. And that can be tough as well, right? So here is what I tell my clients. What happens, one of the challenges of interviewing right now is this. Companies, and I don't mean to throw companies under the bus, but I think those of us who have helped to create interviews, who've helped to establish job descriptions, understand that this is happening a lot. Job descriptions and the whole hiring process is very outdated. So typically what's happening is we're doing things just the way they've always been done, which means, you know what, I'm just going to get a sense of this person. I'll know if they're a good culture fit, just if they fit with me. And we know that that's like, it's a total crapshoot. Studies show that if an interviewer is going solely on their gut, if they like someone or not, they will get better results from hiring someone based on flipping a coin than they will in their gut, because bias is that wrong about making us like someone and overlooking things that are going to cause them to fail in the job. And so what happens is a lot of interviews end up being either the person looks up these questions, these very, very specific behavioral questions, which is like, tell me about a time when, and you feel like they're reading off of a list, and they ask you all these super specific questions, and you walk out being like, they didn't ask me about the stuff I really wanted to tell them about, right? Like, I think there's a lot of things I could have told them, they didn't ask me. The other end of the spectrum is this loosey-goosey interview. And overall, my clients love this. They're like, oh, I love it. It's so laid back. It felt so comfortable. I feel like this is a trap, because while it's comfortable while you're in it, they might not have asked you any specific questions at all. They just kind of like let it go, like the natural conversation, where does it flow? And then later they're like, oh, in this conversation with this person seemed really qualified. You don't get picked, not because you weren't qualified, but because they didn't ask you any questions that were relevant and you didn't know what to put forth, right? So to me, the idea is, and this is going to be maybe scary to you, but could you handle an interview where I'm interviewing you and I say to you, look, the whole time we're going to focus on one thing. 30 minutes, 60 minutes, you're going to talk the whole time. You can ask me any questions you want, but I only have one question for you, and I want you to fill the time with this answer. Why should I hire you? And you could go into an interview and you could do that. And that is really about you establishing, why do I feel like I should get this job, and kind of creating that argument. And we'll get into how that fits. I don't expect you guys to be able to do that after 45 minutes or an hour, no matter what I say during this hour, right? There's no amount that I can totally prepare you for that, but I want to plant some seeds in terms of a different way to think about it. And I believe that some of the things today, for some of you, you're going to be like, yes, I know how to run with these on my own. And other people might say, this helped me get started, but I might need more. And everyone's different, and see how you guys feel. But I wanted to set the bar here because this is sort of the beginning of establishing what success looks like in an interview. And I'm going to be drinking my water, which is, I talk all the time. Okay, so let's get into these 4 shifts. Number 1, often what we do, and the only thing that we think to do, is to get feedback after the interview. There's a problem with that. Legally, they're going to be very hesitant to give you feedback after they've already made a decision about who they've hired or not, because it opens them up to a lot of liability to share specifically why they picked one person versus the other. As much as I hate that, I also think some of those things are in place for very specific protections. So we're not going to get into whether that's good or bad. We're just going to say that is the way that it is. So people will say, like, what should I say to get feedback? Should I think a lot of this is a moot point, because overall, it's often not a good use of your time to even try to get this feedback. I know people who are successful in getting this, but for me, usually they're like 1 in 50 are actually successful at doing this. If you have a very specific personality, you might be able to do this if you feel comfortable being really assertive and that kind of thing. So here's what I want you guys to try instead. It's actually one thing that's going to feed into 2 of these shifts. So I want you to solicit feedback during the interview. First, I'm going to tell you why I want you to do this, and then I'm going to tell you how to do it. So the reason I want you to do it during the interview is because I think the feedback you're gathering is really important. There's 2 types of feedback you're going to get. One type of feedback is going to be things on how you could have interviewed differently, or you will see like, oh, they didn't like me for this reason, but that's actually something that I could have changed. And other types of feedback will be, you just don't have the right experience. And the reason it's really important to get both those types of feedback is often we'll look at feedback that people are truly telling us, you're just not the right fit. Like, no matter what you did, no matter what you said, you wouldn't be. And we often change the way we interview, change the way we pitch to the person that was never going to hire us, which takes us farther away from the person that wanted to hire us, that is looking for us. So that's half the battle, is understanding who's looking for me, who's going to value what I bring to the table. And a great example of this is when you think about moms, and especially when you think about moms who've taken time off. And we're seeing an increasing number of dads and other people take time off, right? I work with a lot of people who've taken a break. But ultimately, you want to be upfront when you have taken time off, because someone is going to value that. And I've talked to so many hiring managers who said, oh my gosh, where was someone like you when I was trying to get back into the workforce? I would be happy to meet any of your clients who are in that situation. They are such an advocate, and that person typically wants to hire you and values that, values family, right? Then you have the other side of it where they're going to see it against you. If that's the case, often there's nothing you can do except be upfront about it. And then that's a sorting hat to see who values you and who doesn't. So that's the why, right? Here's the how, and then we'll talk about that specific question. How do you do this? Keep in mind that this is scary for a lot of people, and it might be scary for you at first. You ask one simple question as far you're close to the end of the interview as you can. And the question is, do you have any reservations about me as a candidate? Now, people will tell you that the reason for asking this question is so that they can tell you their objections and you can overcome those objections. I haven't seen that it get used that way as much as you would think. If you're going for a sales role, that might be a good way to approach it. But really, I want you to have that information so you can take it to future interviews. And I'll give you an example. I asked this myself in a job that I really wanted that I ended up getting. And it was really funny because the interviewer, who was the hiring manager, who now holds a very, very high title at that company, he didn't at the time, said to me, "I hate that question." And I was like, well, we both awkwardly laughed. And in my head, of course, I'm thinking like, oh, I screwed it up by asking that, right? But then what proceeds to happen is the person will often tell you first all the things they like about you. And so he looks at me and he says, "You have a presence that I cannot teach." To this day, that is one of the best compliments I've ever gotten in my life. And I can't believe that someone said that to me. I'm actually so floored by that. And I think it comes from 8 years of teaching high school and being in front of groups and stuff like that, right? And I was like, damn. And I remember walking out of that interview and thinking, well, if you don't hire me, now I'm walking into other interviews knowing that I have that, right? So that is the way that you solicit that feedback. This also comes in extremely handy with people that are going to be your colleagues often interview you. This really brings down their anxiety level about working with you, especially if they view you as extremely qualified, overqualified, threatening to them. They often are like, wow, you want my opinion? It kind of sets that tone that you're going to work with them very well. I also have seen this be very effective with recruiters, because when you're doing that first phone screening, you're talking to HR, they might think it's really weird for you to ask it to them. But I asked this to someone that was a recruiter, and actually he ended up telling me, I think I said to him, after we kind of set up, he said, "Hey, I want to set the next interview." And I said, "You know what, can I ask you something? Do you think the hiring manager is going to have any objections about me or reservations about me as a candidate?" I was pivoting, so I had no idea if I was a good candidate for this job or what. And he said, "I'll tell you what, here's where most people don't pass the in-person interview." And he told me the exact key, and I prepped for that exact thing and I got the job. So this question is really, really good for getting feedback, for getting advice. And keep in mind, some of the feedback you get is not for you to change, and just know, I did everything I could. I can write that one off. That's extremely valuable too, because it allows you to focus. And then this question is actually going to get into some of the other shifts we're going to talk about. So I'm going to circle back to it, but that is the question I want you to ask. Do you have any reservations about me as a candidate? If they give you an objection, you do not have to. If you don't feel comfortable saying, "You know what, could I address that?" Or, "Actually, I do think I have that experience." You can say things like that if you feel comfortable, but give yourself the permission to ask this question the first time, knowing that if you hear something that you don't have to respond to it, you don't have to overcome it, because it may or may not make a difference what you say next anyway. So ask this question, hear the positive, hear things that you couldn't have controlled, and take that information and start gathering it in your interview so that you can use it in the future. Okay, shift number 2. What we often do is we think that the reason we're asking questions in an interview is to only get information, when really the shift I want you to make here is ask questions to show who you are. And I want to hide you guys a little bit. Later, I won't be able to find your faces when I'm looking. Someone remind me, I put it in the bottom right-hand corner. Use questions to show who you are. So if we go back to the question we just asked, when you ask someone, "Do you have any reservation about me as a candidate?" I think I hired 8 people for my team. And then we created a whole new team next to us to create the content for the training team. I think I did an interview a week per year. And it's probably a bit of an exaggeration, factor in, I probably did 30 maybe. Only one person asked me that particular question. And it tells me that that person is someone who wants to get feedback. They want to learn, they want to improve, right? So I learned so much about her because she asked that question. The thing is that a lot of questions they ask you are leading, right? It goes back to like, did they really prepare? Do the questions they ask really tell them what they want to know? Often when they're trying to ask you a question, you know what the answer is. Like they say, how do you handle priorities? Give me an example of a time when you had a conflict. Like everyone knows how to like pander to those questions. When you ask a question, it shows who you are. So here's another example. This is the reason that people ask questions like, what does growth look like? What are the growth opportunities? That tells them that you're someone who wants to grow, who wants to learn, right? And who wants to advance and has a certain level of ambition, right? If you are ambitious, show that. Another example is people will ask the question, what does success look like in this role? That idea, that's a question who shows who you are. Although I think there's a much better way to say that question. That question is really great. And in theory, every interviewer should be able to ask it. They should have thought about that. But I would say many interviewers don't know how to answer that question. They don't really, it's shocking how many people have not written out what is a key performance indicator in this role. After a year, when I do a review, how will I decide if someone was successful? They often haven't written that stuff out. They don't even know. So what I would recommend you ask instead to really show who you are is say something like, can you give me an example of something that has led people to be successful on this team? Or can you give me examples of things that have caused people to not be successful on this team? That is a very specific question. And that is a question to say, I am vetting this. I'm not just going to take any job. I actually want to see if I'm capable and see if I fit with this job. And I actually want to see if we're a good match for each other. So that shows who you are. It shows you're being discerning. It shows you're not just going to take any job. And there are a host of questions out there like that that you can ask that will show them more about who you are than just how you answered their questions. I always think this picture reminds me of Seattle, but I don't think it's Seattle. I think it's just like how open the sculpture is. It reminds me of like South Lake Union. I don't think it's Seattle. Okay, see, this is where my slide thing gets off. There we go. Okay, shift number 3, time check. How am I doing? Okay, good. Often we tell them, we try to explain to them how we'd approach something. So how I want, I think a better way to think about this is to demonstrate. Here's what I mean. And I want to look specifically at my example questions here because I wrote down some examples of, let me see, this one. Okay, so number 1, how many times have you been asked, have you ever used Salesforce? Have you ever used Microsoft Project? Have you ever used this particular CRM tool? How many times have you asked that? And that's like a yes or no question. This one kind of gets deeper into, you can say, what do most people say? I know you're all thinking the exact thing. Most people say, no, but I'm a fast learner, right? That's an example of telling. Here's an example of demonstrating. And I'll never forget, because I was baffled by this question, and I asked my mentor when I was contracting at Microsoft, I said, isn't it obvious that I could learn a tech fast? Like I work at Microsoft, like I've worked on, it was like, to me, that was like, how are you even? And she said, no, think about it. What you want to do is say, no, I have not used Salesforce, but I have used this other CRM tool. And when I got to my company, I didn't know how to use it at all. I found a couple YouTube tutorials. I watched them on my own. I experimented with it and put together some reports. And now I can build reports in it by myself. If I am given another interview, I will be, researching Salesforce before I even get to the next interview. You just told them in the past, specifically an example of something you did. They can't argue with that. It becomes objective versus subjective because you actually did do that thing, right? And the level of detail you just gave is so much so they're going to believe you, because in order for that to be a lie, you'd be a pathological liar to go into all the detail, but also you sort of have to understand what the tool you just talked about can do in order to say, at the end, this is the level of proficiency I reached. I could actually create my own report. Like you have to know that that tool can create reports to even provide that example. So that's a really good example of demonstrating. This is another thing that will happen. They'll ask you a question like, how do you use data to make decisions? That's one that's come up for a lot of current clients. And a how question, or have you ever used it? What's happening is they're not asking you for an example. whenever an example makes sense, I want you to offer an example. So you'll say, at my previous company, I used data to make decisions. And then you'll give them that example. You'll give them that story. And by doing that, it's the same thing we just talked about. It becomes so much more objective. The level of detail shows them how you will approach it in that environment. And you're proving out that you know how to do this because you're giving them like almost a demonstration of your capabilities. So whenever you can, you want to give an example, and that in turn questions into what I'd call a behavioral question. So just because they didn't solicit example doesn't mean it's not appropriate for you to give an example, and always try to work that in where it feels appropriate, whether it's have you used this tool, kind of a yes or no question, or it's, this how would you question, go back to what I've done in the past. And then if it feels appropriate, you may want to say, in this instance, with this information, I would change my approach a little bit because your organization seems like it'd be different or something like that. Awesome. Okay. So shift number 4, I think we're on, right? I should have numbered these. So often we're sort of going into this with like a wish and a prayer, feeling like we are at the mercy of the interview. They are the interviewer, I am the interviewee. There's sort of this power dynamic, and we become like a little bit of a wet blanket because that's how we've been told to do things. That's how we've been taught. That's the only thing we think is acceptable or polite. And there are ways for you to take control. And that's what I'm going to propose here, right? Is take control, little baby, but the idea is in a humble manner. So if you know me at all, you'll know my style is not like to be really aggressive about anything. I have had interviews in my own business where the person was like trying to just like grab control of the entire interview. And I'm like, how would we work together when I would be your supervisor, right? That wouldn't work. I've had people insult me in an interview when it's so baffling. So I have seen the other side of it. Most of my clients and their personality are not in danger of that. And you can think about where you fall on that. But a big part of this is going into an interview and preparing ahead of time what you want to say. This circles full back to the initial goal, which is if I came in and said, why should I hire you? That's the only question. You have 60 minutes to talk about it, and you can ask me any question you want. You could do that because you've planned out what your argument is. It's almost like building an argument if you ever had to do like a persuasive speech or write any type of research paper where, there's a little bit of like, oh, how do I approach this? I have to do the research first and then develop my thesis, or a little bit. There's a little bit of that in the way that you prepare an interview, in having to figure out what is my thesis? Who am I? And it goes back to like, I don't want to just be in the box that they're telling me to be in, because otherwise if my thesis is changing for every interview, it means I'm not staying true to who I am. So this comes down to preparing what you want to say ahead of time. And then the best example of this, there's so much I could say about this. And I hope I have the chance to work with some of you a little bit more extensively in my group program, but is to like, how do you build this whole argument? But here's a good example. That moment comes when they say to you, do you have any questions for me? And you think to yourself, like, there was a bunch of things or one really important thing that you didn't ask me about. And to say something like this, I do have some questions for you, but before we get to that, would it be okay if I shared something that is relevant here? And what you're doing is you're asking permission. The analogy would be like, I think about taking the reins, right? So they have the reins and you're saying, would it be okay if I took the reins for a second? And that is confident in the sense, it's confident because you're saying, I know what I want to say about myself, but it's humble because you're not being aggressive or forceful, right? And they want to know. If they're the kind of person you want to work for, they do want to know about you, right? So that is something where all of my notifications just popped up. They truly do want to know who you are. And so it would be really odd for them not to completely welcome that situation. Like, who is going to say no? And notice how I asked it as a yes or no question, because you want to try to guide them towards saying yes, right? But it'd be weird if they didn't want to know something extra about you, right? So that's the example. And that's kind of the dip test, is when you get to that point in the interview, you say, oh, I'm so glad they asked me all these things, or there's something else I really wanted to share that I wasn't able to get across, and put that in there, right? You see asking if you have any reservations, that's a form of taking control, right? All the other shifts basically fall into this bucket of taking control too, right? And then the other thing that I'd love to talk about more if we had time is the idea of communication framing, clarifying, making sure you understand questions, how to check in with them without undermining yourself, things like that. So there's an aspect of preparing to take control, and then there's an aspect of communication framing and kind of flying above it and talking about the communication to check in with them. And that's something that I often spend an hour talking to clients about, is what's that communication framing going to look like. And maybe that's something, now that I say that and you know about the idea of communicating really strongly, maybe that'll give you some ideas to kind of DIY this as well. How to know if this program is right for you. In reality, part of this is some people on here aren't going to need extra help beyond this. You're going to hear this, you're going to go, I can DIY this, I feel great, I'm good to go. Other people are going to say, I feel like after this, I got some good things to walk away from it. I hope that there was value in just being here and that it was worth your time, but needing the idea of if you need more help. So you feel stuck. Most of the people that I work with, and interviewing is probably the most broad, but most of the people I work with are making a pivot. So often that's, how do I rewrite my whole story to fit with the new job that I'm going for? As someone who made a pivot 2 different times in the way that I interviewed, this can be really challenging, especially with all the noise of, you have to say this and you have to pitch yourself this way. I think often it can send us in this tangent of nothing feels authentic. I also work with people who've taken a break. So if you're really struggling with in depth with the messaging, if you've taken more time off, that it wasn't just COVID, you've been off for 2 years or more. I've had clients, a lot of my clients have been off for 2 years or more. I had a client who didn't work for 20 years during a paid gig, and we landed her a consulting job with Amazon Web Services. So no challenge I feel like is too big in that regard. Pivoters, if you're coming off of a toxic work environment, that is often really difficult, because when you're trying to write out your story, a lot of my clients get stuck because they're like, how am I going to establish my value and argue that I am good for this job when I was never told I was doing a good job? I don't know what was helpful because no one would tell me. That gets really, we're all human. I don't think there's a person on earth who isn't affected by that. And that coming for Silk is one of the reasons I felt that when I was going out and getting a job. I thought, if I don't quit right now, I'm going to get deeper and deeper to this hole of not feeling like I'm providing value, and I'm going to have a harder time kind of pitching myself, right? If you don't feel comfortable selling yourself, this is really important, because I don't want to overly talk about like men, women, because I think this is not necessarily a gender problem, but 85% of my clients are women. A lot of the other clients that I work with that are men tell me they have this too. And here's what I think happens. There are people around you who've been successful because they sell themselves, right? Because they're really good at sort of bragging. And we look at that and we go, I think that person is full of BS. And if I think I can see through that person, if I do the same thing, people are going to see through it. So even though you think I might be able to like get success by kind of just embellishing or fluffing or bragging, I'm never going to do it because it doesn't feel right to me. And I'm the same way. I don't think that in itself is something I don't aspire to be. And I don't care. It's not about being successful. My integrity comes first. I want to stay true to myself first. And so a lot of what I work on with people is, how do we start really leaning to this demonstrating thing? How do we dig through your experiences and find the experiences that are going to sell you, so you don't have to? So you don't have to say, I'm really good at this. You can say, I've done this before, and here's what I did, and here was the outcome, and here's how I'd value. Especially if you don't have numbers. Most of my clients don't have numbers, and I've had several clients recently just get paralyzed over this idea of like, I don't have a number here, I don't have a number here. And I say, we're still going to come up with a value statement. Even though you don't have numbers, we can pull that out. So that's the way that I operate, is I'm not going to tell you to be more confident. I think confidence is kind of bullshit. I'm not going to tell you to like brag more or sell yourself or just like throw yourself at it. I'm going to lean back on, how can we make this very experiential and talk about your experiences? And that in itself is a big piece of this, right? So if you feel like that's you, I would love you to go and just check out the program, see if it's right for you, and then look at whether you want to apply for a scholarship or whether you want to purchase one of those last seats that has an interview built into it, a mock interview. Here's my website. I also typed it into here. I think I got that right. What I want to do is this, and for your time, and I think you guys coming, and even if you take this and say, this was great, I got what I needed and go, I really appreciate you coming and giving me the chance, because it's on me now to say, maybe you got what you needed and that was perfect for you, but to create a raving fan out of you. And because you gave me your time, what I want to do is anyone who purchases the Interview Boost program by midnight tonight, there are, I want to say there's like 16 spots left total. I do limit my groups to a certain size to make sure that people get enough attention. So it's very possible we could sell out tonight. So maybe those will go before midnight anyways. Midnight tonight, whatever time zone you're in, that'll work because we're in Pacific, right? If someone's international, if you miss it, deadline, let me know and I'll check your time zone. What you're going to be able to do is actually write out your stories. I'm going to give you a template. Every person in the program, if you've already signed up, I think there are people on here who already signed up, you get this too. So anyone who signed up before today, and I'm actually going to go through your stories, and I have a writing team. So either me or my writer, Stephanie, will go through it and say, we'd like more information here. Here's where we can be more specific. It sounds like this is really valuable, and help you build your story with written feedback and give that individual attention to anyone who purchases today as a thank you for people who came to this. And like I said, there's 16 spots. So it possibly might sell out tonight, but yeah, get them while you can. I haven't put up a wait list yet. So if you guys hit the point where there's a wait list, I'll put that up if we sell out. And yeah, that way you guys can hear about it when I do the next cohort, which is usually a couple months from now. Yes, scholarship. So I'm going to get to, there is two more pieces of Q&A that came in. I'm going to answer those 2 questions. If you put in your question before I finish talking about this, I will also answer it. I really, really want to do scholarships, and there's 2 reasons. So I want to encourage any person who has the desire to apply for a scholarship to apply for it, no matter what, right? We will sift through them. We will figure out who we want to give them to. But I want you to feel you can always apply. I don't want you to feel comfortable applying, because I think people often think, for me to have a scholarship, I have to be really disadvantaged economically. Well, that's not necessarily true, right? One of the reasons is typically I don't work as much with someone who's a new grad. I do have a couple programs with universities I'm running, and those have been a lot of fun, but I have a lot of people coming out of graduate programs. If you are sitting under, I had $57,000 of debt by the time that I graduated from my master's. That was just a mountain on top of me. If that's you, I would love you to apply for a scholarship, right? Please feel free. I have worked with people who are widowed. I've worked with people who are divorced and going to run out of money. You think about some of these things maybe affecting certain groups, women more, that sort of thing. I've worked with people who have had crazy health issues, who've had to take time off because their family has had health issues. I think if you've taken a bunch of time off to raise a family, that is a completely legitimate reason. Maybe then you don't have as much money because you took that time off to raise your family. I value all of those things, and I really want to give back to people who have been taking care of the things that I think are really important. There is another reason, and I want to be thoughtful about the way that I say this. And if anyone has a critique in the way that I say this, please welcome. But part of this is I went to a training recently on how to have an anti-racist business. And I really do believe that when we look at the statistics, systematic racism is a problem. And I want clients who believe that, honestly. And so when we think about that, I look at my past group programs and I say, they've been pretty diverse, but they could be a lot more diverse, right? And I don't want there to be that limitation. And when we look at those systematic problems, that means typically we might find ourselves in a room of people who all look like us. And I believe that the people who pay for this program are going to have a better experience if we diversify this. And having a scholarship is one way to help that and get that moving. So that's another thing that you might want to think about applying, or think about. It's not just like an economic disadvantage. It's not just a challenge I had in my life. It could also be the thought of, I wouldn't pay for this, or I don't feel like I fit in to this, but I would consider it if it was provided for me. So basically, everyone apply, tell your friends to apply. We've sold a bunch of seats for this. We already have a really awesome group, but I have not had as much scholarship applications I want. And that's on me. I have to do some research and really go out looking for those people as well. So that being said, there's still scholarships available. Let me know if you have any questions about the scholarships, you have any questions about the program, any questions about anything at all. I already got a couple emails, so I'll make sure to answer those. And just thank you guys so much for your time. And yeah, I hope to see you around on Instagram or LinkedIn, or maybe in the Interview Boost program.